Members of the committee, I'd like to call us to order for this morning. It's our meeting of the Public Accounts Committee, and today we have with us witnesses that are going to be speaking about the administrative penalties for occupational health and safety, and our witnesses are from the Department of Labour and Advanced Education. And just before we get started, I'd like to have the members of the committee introduce themselves, and if we could begin with Mr. Ramey.
Gary Ramey, MLA Lunenburg West.
Matt Wynot, MLA Hammonds Plains Upper Sackville.
Clary McKinnon, MLA Pictou East.
Good morning and welcome. Howard Epstein, MLA for Halifax, Chebucto.
Alan McMaster, MLA for Inverness.
Diana Whalen, I'm chair of the committee and MLA for Halifax Clayton Park.
Terry Spicer, Assistant Auditor General.
Jacques Lapointe, Auditor General.
Darlene Henry, Committee Clerk.
We should have your light come on, yes. Yeah, we'll have you introduce yourselves as well. We'll have our guests.
Thank you. My name is Vince Garnier. I'm the Provincial Director of Investigations, Technical and Internal Services with the OHS Division.
Good morning. I'm Jeff Conrad. I'm the Associate Deputy Minister at Labour and Advanced Education.
Jim LeBlanc, the Executive Director of the Occupational Health and Safety Division.
Laurie Bennett, Manager of Financial Services.
Oh, thank you very much. And as is our custom, we'll begin with an opportunity for you to have a statement and tell us a little bit about the program that we'll be looking at today. And I believe that would be Mr. Conrad, if we could. See if our legislative TV has the right person. No, one over. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Madam Chair, and thank you all for having us this morning. So I'm very pleased to be here, and obviously we've already introduced ourselves and folks have a sense of who we are. I would start by saying we really do have a great team in the Occupational Health and Safety Division. We have people that are very committed to the work and long-serving, knowledgeable folks that are engaged in this work, so I'm really pleased to be here with such a knowledgeable group. So I do want to say a few words about the administrative penalties program that we have. And give you a bit of a sense or a bit of an overview of some of the issues, and then we'll take questions gladly afterwards. So administrative penalties are an initiative that was designed to support our efforts to make Nova Scotia's workplaces safer and healthier. The regulation was passed in September of 2009, and the workplaces in Nova Scotia had about a 4-month period to learn about administrative penalties before they came into effect on January 15, 2010. One thing I would say is that as a result of the beginning of the administrative penalties program, one of the things we see is that people in Nova Scotia are talking about health and safety more than they have in the past. So administrative penalties really has raised the level of dialogue and discussion to a level we've not seen in a long, long time around occupational health and safety issues and the importance of safety in workplaces in Nova Scotia. So that's been a really positive outcome of the penalty program. Every day, the way the process works is that staff from Occupational Health and Safety Division visit workplaces across the province. When one of those staff would see a violation of the Act or of the regulations that we're responsible for, one of the things they can do is issue an order to correct the situation. So we issue an order to the employer. Last year, we issued 4,950 orders in this province to correct issues that we found in workplace. Each order gets entered into a computerized tracking system that we maintain in the department, and then it is reviewed by an administrator for the admin penalty system. That administrator determines whether a penalty is appropriate, and it has a set of guidelines which are pasted on our website, and you have copies, I think, of the material we've shared in advance, that folks can see what the process is we follow in order to determine a penalty and what amount it is. We scale those penalties based on level of responsibility at the workplace. So one of the things the admin penalty process does is it takes into account the level of responsibility that an individual has to ensure health and safety in that workplace. So for a worker receiving his or her first administrative penalty, we have a base fine level of $100. And if the contravention involves an injury or the risk of an injury, we could double that amount up to $200. For a supervisor, an owner or a self-employed person, the base fine is $250 because we believe there's a greater level of responsibility for safety in that workplace. Again, if there's an injury, the fine would double up to $500. In the case of the organization that has the most responsibility, an employer, a contractor, a builder, a supplier, an occupational health and safety service provider, or an architect or engineer with project management responsibilities, those folks that have a higher level of responsibility, the base fine would be $500 and would double to $1,000 if there's an injury or potential for immediate injury. The administrator also has the authority to increase or decrease these fines, these base fines, based on 3 other factors. What efforts were made to prevent the contravention? Was there economic benefit to the person to whom the administrative penalty was issued? And what was the level of harm or potential harm of the contravention in question? The administrator also checks to see if the party has been convicted under the Occupational Health and Safety Act or has received a previous administrative penalty within the past 3 years. And I would point out that because we started the process in January 15, 2010, that's the farthest back we go in terms of looking. So we won't have a full 3-year window to review until we get 3 years into the program. We don't go back previous to January 2010. If there are convictions or other penalties in that look-back period, then the fines on the individual, supervisor, or business are doubled. Under the regulations, barring a doubling of the administrative penalty because of those previous contributions, the maximum amount that an employee can have, even under the administrator's ability to increase or decrease the fines, is $500. For a supervisor, owner, or self-employed person, $1,000 maximum. And for that last category of employer, contractor, builder, supplier, service provider, architect, or engineer, we would look at a $2,000 maximum. So there is a range of ability in there to tailor the penalties to the issue. One of the things we did to coincide with the launch of the administrative penalties program was we did a fairly active campaign to make sure that people are aware of the issues and aware of the program and that it was coming in. So we distributed publications. We have a very robust online set of resources on our websites. And we made more than 60 presentations across the province, and folks like Vince and his colleagues have been out all over this province making these kinds of presentations, and we continue to do this now. And prior to the introduction of the penalties, we made 60 of those presentations, some of those with audiences up to 200 people, often with industry-specific organizations and folks that would actually be engaged in the kind of work that we would be involved with on a regular basis. One of the things I would point out that we believe is really important, and is sometimes misunderstood with regard to administrative penalties, is that they do not bring any new responsibilities for employers and employees. So we'll get the question of, well, why didn't you give us a warning before you upped our responsibilities? In fact, the administrative penalties did not up the responsibilities of employers and employees. What it does is enforce the existing regulations and act that we have for occupational health and safety. So as before, if an employer and supervisor or an individual wants to avoid an order or avoid a penalty under the Act or regulations, following the Act and regulations is the best way to do that. And also we believe the best way to make Nova Scotian workplaces safe. We believe that administrative penalties are having an effective and appropriate enforcement measure. So we see that in other provinces such as British Columbia, Manitoba, and the Yukon, there are similar programs. And other jurisdictions are very interested in our model. For example, some of you may have recently heard or be familiar with the Dean Report, which is an expert advisory panel on occupational health and safety in the province of Ontario. And one of the recommendations of that advisory panel is that the province of Ontario should implement an administrative penalty system and regulations similar to the one in Nova Scotia. So they've actually looked at our process as the model that they've recommended in their province. We're also in the process, of course, of listening carefully to feedback that we've received during the first year of the administrative penalty process, and we continue to do so with an eye towards improving the system. Any new system we roll out, we're always looking for opportunity to make it better, and we've certainly have some thoughts on how we could move forward into the future with this program to further create positive impacts on workplaces. So looking at the long term, we expect that administrative penalties will result in greater compliance and will lead to fewer orders being written in Nova Scotia and healthier, safer workplaces. So I want to close, Madam Chair. I want to thank the members for patience and attention during my remarks, and we're certainly happy to take any questions that folks may have for us.
Well, thank you very much, Mr. Conrad. That was a great start. In the absence of my colleague from the Liberal Caucus, I believe there's an accident on the bridge today. I did hear that when I was driving in, so I'm thinking that is the cause. So we're going to begin with the Conservative Caucus and ask Mr. McMaster to kick it off. Thank you.
Thank you, Madam Chair, and thank you for coming today and giving us an opportunity to ask some questions. What happened before? What drove this legislation into being?
what I would say is that we have a fairly wide range of tools that we use to administer occupational health and safety in the province. So we continue to have all of those tools in terms of public awareness, the issuing of orders, the expectations that we have in place, the education programs that we run. We have great partnerships in terms of occupational health and safety with organizations like safety associations, the Workers' Compensation Board. We also have the ability to do summary offense tickets in certain circumstances, and of course in extreme circumstances to do prosecutions in the courts. Certainly one of the things that I think we found is that, organizations weren't always taking us as seriously in terms of orders as we would have liked. So to issue an order which has no teeth behind it, there's a requirement under the Act. We do follow-up. We try to make sure employers and others participate in the system, but it's very challenging for us. So that would be one driver. I think another driver for us would be that one of the challenges that is often reported to us by employers is that it's sometimes difficult to get your employees to participate. So when we have all of the responsibility on the employer in the workplace, so again in the construction industry, the roofing industry, we'll get comments from employers that would say, I buy fall protection equipment, I buy the appropriate scaffolding, I buy the appropriate materials and safety equipment at my workplace. I leave or my supervisor leaves to run down to Home Depot or pick up supplies, and my workers are up on the roof with their fall protection on, not tied off to anything. And the worker thinks, it's inconvenient, it's a hassle, I've always done it this way, and it's a real challenge to get them to participate. Although we've done relatively few penalties to actual individuals in the process so far, it's really made people sit up and take notice that you have a responsibility in the system as well as your employer. Jim, you were around prior to me. Do you have any comments on some of the drivers?
Just maybe an additional comment, because we do have a standing committee of stakeholders that advise the minister in relation to occupational health and safety. And one of the issues that they'd raised with us was to identify some additional enforcement options as they saw the issue of compliance with the laws as being something that could be improved. So there was some additional consultation with stakeholders in terms of finding other options that were available, and this is one that is used in other jurisdictions, and it was a model that was looked at here.
Thank you. And how have employers taken to the new system?
Is it Mr. Conrad?
Yeah, I'll make a few comments. As you can imagine, those employers that have received the penalties themselves are not always enamored with our efforts, but we found that with orders, and we find that with prosecutions and any number of other things. I think what I would say, however, is that, for example, these stakeholder groups that we work with and the advisory councils that we have and the large associations, while I wouldn't say that they welcome the penalty process, I think certainly see some value in it in terms of the ongoing changes that we think it's going to make and the awareness that it's raising and that kind of thing. We continue to have some opportunity to talk about the process and how the system works. But our advisory council and kind of the stakeholders that are involved in the system see a lot of value in the system. It's always difficult when you're in receipt of a penalty to stand up and say, yay, it's exciting to get a penalty. But I think we have some cooperation on that front.
Okay. And what about, you had mentioned an interesting point about fines also apply to individuals who may be working for a company or an organization. How have they taken to it? Are they kind of surprised by it, or are they? I'll let you comment.
Yeah, maybe I'll make a few comments, and then Vince may want to make a few comments. Certainly one of the things we've seen is a higher rate of appeal than we originally anticipated. So we originally thought we'd get about a 10% rate of appeal, and we're about a 30% rate of appeal. So I think part of that is reflective of people believing that it's early days of a new program, and people believing that, they need to understand the process and follow through it and understand how it works. So I think a bit of getting used to the system in terms of the go forward. But Vince is closer to the operations than I am. Maybe I'll let him make a comment.
Thank you.
Mr. Garnier, yes.
Thank you. As mentioned earlier, I've had an opportunity to speak with stakeholder groups across the province. In the early stages, a large percentage were in favor and thought it was a good idea, because I should point out, although the officers had the ability to issue compliance orders, the next step if they won it, was prosecution, so involve the courts, where the fines could be up to a maximum of $250,000. So the introduction of the administrative penalties does not involve the courts. So it's a kind of a lower end bar, if you will, and lower fines and that sort of thing. So people tended to favor this approach. That kind of changed a bit as individuals started actually getting the penalties. So while many of them were in favor of them, or the idea of having the administrative penalties, once they received the fine, they perhaps weren't as enamored with the regulation. It's no different. I think we all agree that there needs to be speeding laws in the province, but none of us really like to get a speeding ticket. Right? So it has caused a dialogue that in such a way that we really haven't seen in a long, long time. And that's good. There needs to be a dialogue. We need all workplace parties to be thinking about health and safety and to truly understand that they all play a part. And like the ADM has mentioned, it's not just the employer that has the responsibility for workplace health and safety. It's all parties. And this is really emphasizing that and talking to the internal responsibility system of the OHS Act, which is really the foundation. So I think the administrative penalties marries the IRS under the OHS Act.
Okay, thank you. You had mentioned there's been a higher instance of appeals than expected. I presume that probably adds to the cost of the operations. Can you explain a little bit about what happens when there's an appeal?
Mr. Conrad.
Yeah, we can say a few words about the appeal process, and it is a very structured appeal process. So there's actually 2 levels of appeal within the process. So employers have an opportunity when the order is issued to appeal the order. So one of the questions we sometimes get is, why does the administrative penalty come later than the actual issuing of the order? And that's because we want to give people an opportunity to appeal whether or not the order that was originally issued was actually something that they agree with and would support. So they have an opportunity to appeal the order, and that's a long-standing process that existed before the administrative penalty system, and that's been no change in terms of what we see in terms of appeals to the orders. In the administrative penalty system, in addition to appealing the order, they can appeal the actual issuing of the penalty, whether or not there should have been a penalty and the amount of the penalty, to our appeal panel. That's a fairly formal process. It does go into the system. We think the anomaly in terms of the higher level of appeals really is a startup issue. So we have employers who say, I had orders before, I never got an administrative penalty, it must be a mistake, I'm going to appeal it, right? Mm-hmm. So it's part of an education process in the go forward. We are working with our appeal panel around timing of those, of hearing of those appeals and that issue in terms of addressing that unexpected level. We've also done some work with the appeal panel members in terms of really understanding the administrative penalty system well and making sure that the decisions of the panel are appropriate. So we've done a number of things to work our way through that. We really have already started to see some modest reduction in terms of the number of appeals, and we think that will continue over the next little bit as people get more used to the system, come to understand what it is.
Okay, thank you. I know on the other side of, like in our court system and in our prosecution services, because you have this new vehicle to use to enforce penalties, I guess we're saving money on that side of in that area of government. Can you explain a bit about that, how that's happened, and maybe in terms of what quantity of savings have been achieved?
Sure, we can say a few words there. I don't know that we've tracked the actual savings. I think, as Vince said in his earlier comments, one of the advantages of the administrative penalties is it gives us a tool between an order with no teeth behind it and a prosecution. So the challenge in a prosecution process is to get something which is worthy of the court's time in terms of taking forward a prosecution. We still prosecute. We still have an active agenda in terms of prosecuting where prosecution is the appropriate tool for us to use. So I would say that our opportunity with the administrative penalties is, rather than savings in terms of what we've saved as a result of not using the court process, is more in terms of we've instituted an extra step that we didn't have before. So there may have been things before where we thought, okay, well, this warrants more than an order, but doesn't really fully justify going to the court and taking the court's time for the issue, but we don't have any other options. Whereas now we have another option. Is that fair, Vince, in terms of?
Mr. Gagne?
Thank you. Just one extra point I'd like to add is that when an officer makes a decision to prosecute a workplace party because of a contravention, it's kind of an opportunity cost issue. It actually, because the process is so involved, it takes the officer out of the field into the office, putting their evidence together in a very, very formal way that meets the test required by the Crown, and then court time and so forth. So sometimes this can take weeks or longer, and that means the officer is in the office doing that paperwork and not in the field doing proactive inspections to ensure that workplaces are compliant and people are safe. With the administrative penalties, the opportunity for us is to allow the officers to spend more time in the field doing proactive work, education, compliance, and enforcement, while one administrator takes care of the penalty system. So our inspections are able to continue in a productive way while the penalty system is still allowed to flourish.
Okay. What about, I think the revenues that you've, in the first year of the program were about $700,000 in fine revenue. And I think costs were somewhere in the neighborhood of maybe $150,000. It sounds like you found a way to better enforce the rules, to bring greater safety to the workplace at a lower cost. Would that be safe to say? When you compare it, I guess, with the previous system of having to prosecute people and take them through the court process and whatnot.
Yeah. Yes, we would believe that this is a more cost-effective way for the province to operate, for sure.
Okay. I would think progressive employers would be okay with these kinds of changes because they see the value. And you know, I've seen workplaces where they actually post their days that they've operated without injury time, because of course it saves them money if there's safe practices in the workplace. Have you had any employers complaining that saying this is, you know, this is too heavy-handed, or has anybody been making complaints of that nature?
There are some complaints with the system, as there will be in any new system. So I guess a couple of places where we're looking at places where we may want to think about and modify or adjust the process, for example, would be the issue of when I talked about we look back over the last 3 years to look at whether or not employers have a previous admin penalty. So some employers, because they're very large employers, work in a lot of workplaces across the province and have a wide range of responsibilities in those workplaces, have received multiple penalties, which means automatic doubling the next time around. One of the things that we've gotten some feedback on in terms of those employers is that we're not doubling the penalty based on an infraction of a similar type before. So we may give you take a large construction company that may have multiple workplaces across the province over the course of a year. We may issue an infraction related, or an administrative penalty related to traffic control, and 3 months from now we may issue an administrative penalty for an entirely different system, for a entirely different reason, fall restraint in another site. So should we think about, when we look back at penalties, whether it's a repeat of a similar type of occurrence, or is it just a fact that they've contravened the Act or the regulations in the past? So that would be an example of a place where we've had some lobbying. We're having conversations with some of those employers and industry associations and others to say, okay, there's some value in that conversation. We haven't made any decisions yet on how we're going to proceed with that, but it's an example of a place I think you'll see in our annual report and others where we're thinking about options to improve the system. Maybe Jim would also like to.
Mr. LeBlanc.
Thank you. Maybe I could just add a couple of things, because we did provide in your package a copy of the one-year review of the admin penalty regs, and that report was provided to our Occupational Health and Safety Advisory Council for their review as well, in terms of what our experience has been and what some of the suggestions that have been made for changes were. I think it's, as was pointed out, it's fairly easy to conclude that people who receive penalties will often take objection to the fact that they have received it. But at the same token, we do hear from other folks that have a concern in terms of us taking a sufficient effort to level the playing field, because the many employers who do their best and comply with the health and safety laws in the province are often put in a circumstance where they have to compete against companies who may not, and take some shortcuts in terms of getting work done. So we've had comments, I guess, on both sides of the equation, both in favor of a stronger enforcement system, which is more visible, and one that basically ensures that those that are in violation or in contravention of the law basically are taken to task for that.
Thank you. Is there a hope that workers' compensation premiums would reduce over time if these penalties are starting to help, I guess, bring to bear more safety-minded workplaces?
Mr. Conrad.
I think combined with a lot of the other things we do, that there's always, one of the goals we have is always to affect what employers and others are contributing and what the costs of the system are. So what I would say to you is that last week I was at a meeting and with our colleagues from the Workers' Compensation Board, and actually we have an advisory council that both the Workers' Comp group and ourselves sit on, which meets today. And I was saying I wasn't able to be there this morning because I was going to be here. And the acting CEO of the Workers' Compensation Board said to me, well, make sure you do a really good job of defending those administrative penalties. We think they're a huge tool in the toolbox in terms of getting Nova Scotians to pay attention to that piece. One of the things we certainly would say in terms of that question is, as we see compliance with the Act and the regulations increase, we will see injuries decrease. And when you think about rates are generally established based on the incident of injury in the workplace. So if we can use tools like this, along with a whole range of others, to increase compliance, we should see reduction in premium.
That's great. And I can appreciate you're not with workers' compensation, but do they actually use incidents of injury based on Nova Scotia, or do they use like a national average?
I'm going to defer that question to Jim. He's much more familiar with the details of how the two organizations work together.
Mr. LeBlanc.
Thank you. In terms of the rate structure, it's based on the accident experience for the industry sector. So the WCB combines similar firms into rating groups, and the average rate that the sector pays is based on the cost of claims to that sector, and then that rate is adjusted up or down based on the experience of individual companies.
Right. And would they be Nova Scotia companies, or they would look on a national, like if they looked at an industry sector, would they look at like a Nova Scotia industry sector? Would they expand that and look at the incidents across, say, Canada?
No, the insurance rates are based on the costs, the claim costs, and the administration costs within the province.
Within the province, okay.
But I think if you look across the country nationally, although the rates vary relative to one another, the same industry sectors are probably in the same place relative to each other. So
sure.
If mining is high in Nova Scotia, it's probably high in Ontario and Quebec and other jurisdictions as well, because part of it is the nature of the industry.
Exactly. Okay, thank you. How have you educated workplaces of the changes?
Mr. Conrad.
The changes to the administrative penalties program in particular? We've done a number of things. So as I said in my opening comments, one of the things we've been very active about is we've done a lot of presentations across the province to organizations and associations. So you can appreciate that we are regularly invited to participate in workshops, conferences, meetings, those kinds of things. So we do it through organizational sectors, we do it through safety associations, we do it. So prior to the days leading up to the implementation of the penalties, we did 60 presentations in the 4 or 5 months prior to the implementation. We continue to do that. Vince and I were actually at a session in the spring where we had collaboratively with the Construction Association of Nova Scotia, for example. We had 200 or so people in a large room, and Vince had the exciting opportunity to stand up and debrief on the first few months of the program and talk about how many penalties we'd put in place and what it had meant. But it is a great way to get information out. We did a fairly active campaign in terms of producing literature and spreading literature around. We have a newsletter, an electronic newsletter that we distribute to people in the province that are interested in being on our list, and I think somewhere over 2,000. around 500 businesses are in receipt of that newsletter, so we would have included information in that. Our website is quite actively used, and we updated our website in terms of that. And then we have access to a national system called the knowledge-based system, and we would have done updates as a result of people that are accessing the national information system as well. So we made certainly strong, and then of course the normal, news releases and departmental messaging prior to this coming up. So we were certainly tried to be very active in terms of letting folks know, and continue to be active, because one of the things is, we're not in this business to. Our goal at the end of the day is not to issue orders or issue penalties. Our goal is to improve compliance with the system and make workplaces healthier and safer. We'd be perfectly happy if people would be afraid of getting a penalty and avoid them by complying with the Act and the law. So that's really what we want. Our promotional piece is really to try and get people to comply.
Thank you.
And thank you very much. The time's elapsed for the first round of questioning, and we're going to go to Mr. Caldwell, who's joined us for the Liberal Caucus. And I should say as well, we've been joined by 2 other members, Mr. Porter and Mr. Scabar. So if you would, 20 minutes, Mr. Caldwell.
Thank you very much. First, businesses have the impression that there's some kind of quota system that you have to get to fulfill your mandate. Is there any truth in that? I know the police departments have some quotas in place. Each month they have to meet, and I was wondering if you have the same sort of system.
No, in fact, there's no quota associated with the system. As you can imagine, in implementing the system, one of the things we were required to do is to do some estimates around kind of what we expected, how many employers, how many individuals, the kind of expectations we had around the number of penalties we would be issuing. And we did some work around, trying to estimate, given the way we expected the system to roll out. But there's no quota on the system, and there's no quota on the individuals that are administering the system in terms of either number of orders, number of administrative penalties, or dollar value of any of those penalties.
You would have records of all the money that you generated, detailed records of the money administrative penalties in 2010, 2011 so far?
We would, yes.
Could you provide that to our committee?
Maybe I'll defer that to Laurie Bennett. I don't know that we have, I think we've provided some information in terms of the information that's been provided in the pre-reading. There's some of the 10-11 information in there, and I believe there was financial information included in that package, but we can verify that the detail was there and provide it.
Would you like Ms. Bennett to add anything to that?
Yeah.
I know you've brought your financial person, and we appreciate that.
Do you have the numbers right there in front of you in terms of?
He has it in the book.
Yeah. So yes, there is a spreadsheet in your package that's been issued in terms of the financials to date, and there's a chart in there that shows 2009, 10, and 10, 11, and year to date in terms of the amounts that have been generated in the system so far.
I didn't get a chance to see that, but is it broken down by types of penalties, and whether it's employees, employers, supervisors, whatever it is?
Perhaps I could let Vince speak to that in terms of as the administrator of the system. He's pretty familiar with those numbers.
Sorry, Mr. Bennett. Oh, Mr. Gagne.
Thank you. You'll see in your package that we've broken it down to show you the spread in the various areas of the province. So the central area of the province, Cape Breton, and northeast and southwest, and also one of our other sections. So it's broken into 5 different sections based on the geography of the province. It's also broken down by employer, supervisor, and employee. So those figures are spread apart.
Madam Chair, if I may.
Yes, Mr. Conrad.
In addition, if you look at the other thing that we've provided, we were asked to provide a list of individual employers that have been assigned penalties. So you'll see there's a list of all the employers, the date the order was issued, and the class of the individual, of the receiving person, whether it was an employer, a supervisor, an individual, and the amount of the order that was issued. So there's also a fair level of detail at the organizational level.
Yes, I received that. Thank you very much. Very detailed. Sorry about that.
No.
If an employer has an employee that he has nothing but trouble with the occupational health and safety, what's the process the employer would have to go through report that to you, or?
Yeah, perhaps I'll defer that to Jim.
Yeah, Mr. LeBlanc?
Thank you. Normally, occupational health and safety issues in workplaces where an employer and employee have a difference of opinion as to what's required is really no different than most other HR issues. And we would initially expect that an employer would use a normal coaching and discipline process to correct a behavior in a workplace. If an employee, for example, wouldn't use a piece of safety equipment that the employer has indicated is required for a job. So there is some work, and Vince had mentioned earlier the concept of the internal responsibility system, where really the responsibility for health and safety in workplaces resides very much in that workplace. So the initial line of defense is trying to get workplaces to both identify and address any concerns and issues that may arise. And for the most part, employers are very supportive in terms of exercising that system, and employees are supportive as well. In relation to the issue coming to the department, it usually comes by way either of complaint from an employee as a result of an inspection by an officer in a workplace who identifies a specific issue, or in the example that you mentioned where an employer is identifying that they're having some difficulty administering a practice or a policy that they have in place. In all of those cases, the officer would become involved, render a decision as to what was required in order to ensure compliance with the law, and if it was required, issue an order to the individual to comply, to do whatever they determined was appropriate, and then that brings in the remaining enforcement mechanisms that exist under the legislation to control the behavior.
Do you always collect all the fines from the employer, employees, supervisors, whoever you may charge?
Mr. Conrad?
Because we're still in the early days of the process, it's a little early to answer that question. So what we can say is, of the administrative penalties that we've issued to date, we've collected about 60% of the penalties that we've issued, and there's a number of reasons for that, and one goes back to the appeal process that we discussed earlier. So we don't issue the requirement to pay. The administrative penalty doesn't come into force until 30 days after the decision of the appeal tribunal. So in fact, some of the outstanding issues that we have around collection are because, although we've issued the administrative penalty, it's gone to appeal and is in the appeal process. So of all the orders that we've issued to date, we've collected about 60% of those. If I could just make a reference in response to your earlier question, I thought it might be worth pointing out that in the annual report that we presented to you, one of the things that we have in there is a section on response that we've gotten back from employers and issues around thinking about what we might do in terms of changes to the system. And we included in there a number of verbatim quotes, some of which support the system, some of which are negative. But I would draw your attention under the fairness section that there is, in fact, a quote in there that gets directly to the question you ask of an employer saying to us that they have tried all of the recommended disciplinary measures, such as sending people home for the day without pay, individual typed warnings on files, suspension for a week without pay, with no avail, and uses language like talk about banging your head on the wall. So it's a direct quote from an employer, and goes on to talk about really feeling that the administrative penalties, because it goes to both the employee and the supervisor on the site, really gives the employer another way to highlight the importance beyond what they already had. And that was an employer who actually received an administrative penalty as an employer from us, writing to us to say that they think it was positive because we also penalized the supervisor and the worker who had responsibility. So,
you're seeing evidence that the penalties and the incentives that you're putting in place are really helping the workplace safety?
We've certainly seen falling accident rates in Nova Scotia and falling death rates in Nova Scotia over the last number of years. Since 2006, the Workers' Compensation Board would report that the number of lost time injuries in Nova Scotia has fallen over that period of time, and we've seen the number of deaths fall over that time as well. Obviously, administrative penalties having only been around since January 2010, it's going to take us a little while to see kind of the cumulative impact of the penalties themselves. We do believe it'll have impact, and we think it'll be positive impact. What I would say is that one of the things we think is the fact that we've got people talking about administrative penalties and talking about occupational health and safety issues in general is also a huge piece. So, you know, the administrative penalties in and of themselves are very powerful, but the fact that it's raised the level of dialogue in the system and actually has people talking about how to avoid getting administrative penalties is a huge positive outcome of the process.
Is there any evidence that the program may actually defer some of the underground economy?
Sorry, could you repeat that? May actually
deter some of the underground economy?
I don't think we have evidence to that effect. You know, I think one of the things that that Mr. LeBlanc commented on earlier was that around the comments that we get back around the unlevel playing field. So it's certainly an issue in terms of we regularly get, you know, our good employers who are very committed to their employees and very committed to occupational health and safety are very concerned about issues in the underground economy and the ability to compete. So it's hard to compete when you're buying thousands of dollars worth of safety equipment and training your staff and doing all of the things that are appropriate and regular, and there are people out there that you're competing with that may not be doing that. So I would say that, you know, one of the things we're doing certainly is we actively look for infractions in all of the economy, and we, you know, respond to reports and we respond to complaints. So I don't know that administrative penalties are having a particular impact on the underground economy, but I would say that it's certainly having an impact in terms of that question of leveling the field and trying to get so that people have a responsibility to follow. Again, it gives us that place between just issuing an order and having to prosecute so that we can be more rigorous in terms of an overall enforcement piece.
Mr. LeBlanc, did you want anybody to add to that? Or?
I don't know that I can add much to it. I think that the best deterrent to an underground economy is a robust inspection system that identifies workplaces. And the Dean report, the expert panel report that came out of Ontario, actually looked at that specific issue and made some recommendations to the Ontario government, both in terms to the time inspections are conducted and targeting specific workplaces where more vulnerable workers may be. From the perspective of the department, we're looking at that report in terms of its application to the province. I guess just in closing, I think the inspection regime is really what deters underground economic activity.
You mentioned a while ago that a lot of complaints are employee-driven. How many do you do inspections just beside complaints, or is just complaint-driven totally?
I'm going to let Jim describe to you in general terms the process that we have for following inspections, but no, it's not purely complaint-driven at all. We do respond to complaints, and complaints come from a wide variety of places. So we do certainly get employee complaints. We also get employees in this province have the right to refuse unsafe work, and we encourage employees to refuse unsafe work as part of the responsibility system. So we do get that as well. We get complaints from one employer about another employer, and there's lots of places complaints come from, but we have a fairly robust process in terms of inspections, and if I could, I'll let Mr. LeBlanc give a little explanation of how that works.
Mr. LeBlanc.
Thank you. In terms of our inspection regime, I guess where we would prefer to be and where we try to be is to use a targeted inspection system that's based on claim experience and claim costs or industry sector experience. And we provide to each of our officers that are in the field a list of targeted sectors and employers that we would prefer to inspect. The reality, however, for us is that about 30% of our activity, 40% of our activity is driven by complaints. So we do get a large number of complaints directly, and some of them, as was identified, come from employees. Some of them come from concerned citizens that are observing activity in the province. And our policy at this point is we respond in some fashion to every complaint that we receive. So there is some response, either it's an officer would visit the site, or it's some follow-up to determine what it is needs to be corrected with the employer, or alternatively a referral to the appropriate agency if it's not within our jurisdiction. We found over time, as we track our activity, that complaints do drive a large percentage of our work, but we are trying to sort of push back on that exercise to get to the place where we're doing more targeted activity where we think we can make the biggest difference.
Do you feel at this point, I know it's a bit early in the program, that once you have inspected somebody and made them into compliance and either issued a penalty or not, does it appear that it's improving their safety record in that particular company, or is it just, do you have a whole bunch of repeat offenders?
Mr. LeBlanc? Yes.
Thanks. I think from the perspective of activity and whether or not it makes a difference in the workplace, we've certainly looked at some of the research that's come again out of the province of Ontario from the Institute of Workplace Health, and what they've determined, and they've looked at all the things that changes behavior in workplaces, is that the most significant impact or the most significant influencer in terms of changing behavior in workplace is an inspection. So all the other things that may happen, whether it's enforcement or prosecution or whether it's training, the fact that someone goes in and basically focuses on health and safety issues makes a difference. And so from that perspective, I think our activity in workplaces is critical to changing behavior, and the visibility of an inspection in a workplace brings health and safety to the forefront, both for the employer and the employees, and refocuses their attention on it.
What other tools are available that an officer, an enforcement officer, can go besides the administrative penalties?
Mr. Conrad.
We have quite a range of tools available, and I think, as we said before, the administrative penalties is a great extra piece. So, in terms of the inspection process that we have, obviously, prevention and education is one of the places that, when you think about the foundation of the system. So I guess one of the things I would say is, first of all, in the way the Act and the regulations are set up, it actually puts the responsibility for health and safety on the shoulders of the people involved in the system. So the fundamental part of our process is what we call the internal responsibility system. People are responsible within their organization, within their work team, within their own individual as an employee, responsible for health and safety within the system that they work in. So the responsibility to be safe in the workplace, obviously we can't patrol every day, every minute, 50,000 workplaces in Nova Scotia. So the basis of the system is out there. So the first step in terms of making sure that works well is to make sure that people have the information that they need to make safe and responsible workplaces. So we provide a wide range of education tools, information tools, and we touched on some of those earlier. We have a very robust website. We have a lending library of information that we share with workplaces. We have a national contract with an organization called Knowledge Base that shares the best of practice and what goes on in the country with employers. Our staff that are out in the field have a responsibility and work closely with employers, so when they go in and do an initial inspection and or visit a work site, are doing education programs, helping people. They're sharing brochures and information, and again, we have a pretty wide range of materials that we can leave behind in terms of people understand their responsibility. We have the ability to issue orders in terms of, as I said before, so when we issue 4,950 orders last year, we're seeing about 25% of the orders that are issued lead to an administrative penalty, which tells you that there's a large number of orders out there where we're asking people to change their behavior, change their practice, come into compliance with the Act or regulation, but don't deem it as requiring an administrative penalty to, heighten that expectation. We have the administrative penalty system. We have the ability in certain circumstances to issue summary offense tickets as a police constable would. Obviously, we have the ability to take to prosecution the more serious issues within the system. And then we have the ability to do some really creative and interesting things. And if you might indulge us for a minute, one of the things I said in the opening comments was that we have an incredibly committed and dedicated staff. And Mr. Garnier to my left here a few months ago on a Saturday morning was on his own time visiting a Home Depot to pick up some things for himself, and observed some folks on a roof without fall restraint working for a contractor, and went over and called them down, and had the conversation with them about what the expectation was and what their responsibility was. And on Monday morning, invited that employer into our workplace to have a conversation about this inappropriate behavior. And it was one of those employers that was very frustrated in the system about, had done a lot, had bought safety equipment, had bought, training processes, had done all the things he was supposed to do as an employer, and had staff who just repeatedly, this harness is in the way, I can't work efficiently, it's not quick, it's hot, it's a pain, and weren't using it. So Vince moved very proactively to bring in a number of roofing contractors from the metro area to come in and have a conversation about issues particular to the roofing industry. And unbeknownst to the group, arranged to have a speaker from an organization called Threads of Life. And Threads of Life is an organization, national organization, that arranges speaker bureaus for people that have been impacted by health and safety issues. So Vince arranged on his own to bring in a speaker, flew them down. They flew down from Ontario, and it was the mother of a young man who had fallen off a roof and died in Ontario. And she came in and spoke with that group of roofers, and we actually had some pretty hard-bitten roofers and construction owners in tears in the room. And I can tell you, in this kind of work, we rarely get letters of thanks from organizations for giving them penalties and the things we do. We have a lovely written letter back in the office as a result of Vince's efforts around that, saying that one of those employers wrote in saying they believed that we had saved lives in his workplace as a result of that initiative. So admin penalties is a really important tool, but it's, it's only one of the tools. We have a really wide range of tools in the system.
Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Caldwell. And I'm going to turn the floor over to Mr. McKinnon for 20 minutes. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Madam Chair. It's a pleasure to have the folks from the Department of Labor with us this morning. This is actually a good news story we're hearing when other jurisdictions are looking at Nova Scotia in relationship to the program that has been implemented here. I'm wondering, I think I heard a couple of figures in relationship to the number of orders that have actually been issued. 4,950 sticks in my mind for some reason. And I'm wondering, from a staffing perspective and also from a budget perspective as well, we're dealing with a new program within the department, a new initiative, and I'm wondering if existing officers are doing the job, or how many staff, all or in part, are working at this, and has there been any budget item for it?
Again, I'll defer the main body of this response to Mr. LeBlanc, who's the Executive Director responsible for the area. I think, as he said earlier, we certainly see the ability to do inspections in workplaces as one of the key determinants of the success of the program. And when you think about administrative penalties, although it's a new program, it is a new tool in the tool belt of a group of existing workers. So it's not that we run administrative penalties separate and have folks who only do that. Well, our administrator, who's one position in the system, is responsible for that. But in terms of the issuing of the orders and the information that feeds the system, it's distributed quite widely through the system. But maybe I could allow Mr. LeBlanc to make a few comments.
Mr. LeBlanc.
Thank you. When the administrative penalty program was put in place, it really resulted in one additional FTE within the department, which was the administrator. From the perspective of the day-to-day operation, we haven't asked the officers to do anything differently in terms of how they do their inspection work. So we still ask them to conduct the inspections and the investigations, and where it's appropriate, use the enforcement tools that are available to them. The only difference in the system at this point is that those orders do get reviewed by the administrator in the fullness of time. So we've used some existing capacity within the department. So there is some admin support that's provided. to the administrator in terms of the distribution, and that was done with existing resources. There was an existing appeal process, so we've obviously had to increase the activity. But again, that I guess we could say there was some capacity to utilize the appeal process with the system. So in terms of resources, the only additional resource was the administrator that was added to the system. And that basically results in a very small and some modifications to our computer tracking system for orders, which is a one-time cost to put the system in place.
There was some comment about from the department about 60% of the penalties actually being collected to date. And I'm wondering, the member for Inverness mentioned $700,000, and I wouldn't want to question his figure in any way, but could you elaborate on the actual amount and perhaps follow the money as well? Does that money go into the general coffers, or just a commentary on following that money?
Mr. Conrad.
I guess I would start in reverse order of your question as to where the money goes, and then I'll let Mr. Garnier and perhaps Ms. Bennett say a few words about the money. But in fact, no, the money as collected goes into general revenue, and it is a question that we get on occasion about where the money goes, and we get lobbied, and you'll see in the annual report, some feeling from our stakeholders that the money should in fact be distributed into a fund which would be used for prevention. We get regular lobbying that we should allow for other forms of retribution, so an employer would be able to, instead of paying the penalty, make other modifications in the workplace. I would say a couple of things in related to that before we talk about the specifics of the money. So one would be that we really do want a deterrent in the system, and that the admin penalties, to go back to that fundamental piece, did not create new expectations from an act or regulation perspective. So when an employer would say to us, oh, if you issue me a penalty and I have to spend $5,000 to address that problem, I should be allowed to deduct that off in lieu of a penalty. And one of the things we would say is, no, that was an expectation of the system before. You're expected to run a safe, healthy system that respects the system and it respects the acting guidelines. The fact that you had to spend money to do that is not in lieu of an administrative penalty. It was an existing responsibility in the system. We also get asked about the question of the money coming back to a safety fund or coming back to the department, of course. It would be hard to sit here as people seriously interested in this issue and not say that we'd like to have more money to do more work in this area. Of course we would. But I think I would also say that we really respect the fact that the money does go back to the general account, and that we're funded to do our work as a department from the revenues of the province. So, I think there's a responsibility to make decisions. I've heard the finance minister say a poor province is a weak province, and we need to figure out how to address a whole range of issues within the province. So the money going into the general revenue gives us a chance to come in and work through the normal budget process of saying how important we believe this work is, and it gives the appropriate process for people to balance our work with other work. And certainly we've come in on issues where we've been blessed to receive funding and support to do some of the things we think are really, really important, and we're glad to follow that process. But the money does flow back to general revenue. But maybe in terms of the specifics of kind of the flow of money and our expectations and some of the numbers we've thrown out there that are in the various reports, I could let Vince say a few words.
Mr. Gagne.
Thank you. As of approximately 1 week ago, the actual numbers were 1,740 administrative penalties issued to date. So from January 15th to present, 1,740, totaling approximately $1.1 million. Of that 1.1 million, 641,415 has been collected, and leaves a balance of $439. $439,000. And of that amount, as the ADM indicated earlier, it's not that 439,000 is default payment. A bulk of that is actually tied up in the appeal process now. I should add that any person that does default on their payment, even after the appeal process that confirms the penalty, we've engaged the assistance of Service Nova Scotia and Municipal Relations to assist us with debt collection. So people that do default on their payment, it becomes a debt to the province. And Service Nova Scotia has a host of options to ensure collections, one of which is getting assistance from Canada Revenue Agency to claw back persons' refunds, which actually the first one happened not too long ago.
In response to the member for Preston, a great job was done in how communications was actually handled to get the new initiative across to industry. I'm wondering about workers' compensation has had a considerable budget for actual advertising, and did you have any kind of a communications budget to get this off the ground?
I don't think that we had a specific budget dedicated to administrative penalties as part of the process. Certainly what we did is we utilized, again, existing resources within the department and existing avenues. So we do have, a number of processes that we're engaged in, as I talked about earlier, regularly attending events. We have other avenues. So, we wrote a letter to every Chamber of Commerce in Nova Scotia, for example, fairly low-cost things to roll the piece out. I think we made our efforts in a very focused kind of way to get to employers and employer associations and others that could help us spread the word. The Workers' Compensation Board has responsibility in the system for the prevention mandate for occupational health and safety in the province. So a lot of that promotional work that you see, and we collaborate with them on parts of that and are very pleased with being able to do that on parts of the system. But that responsibility really arises from their responsibility to do prevention, promotion, and a number of other things. So it's a slightly different perspective that they bring to the table in terms of the role that they play in the system. We have kind of a regulatory role, and they have a prevention and insurance kind of role in terms of the system. We really try to work closely together. So again, we talk about their systems and their programs, and as you saw earlier, folks like Mr. LeBlanc and Mr. Garnier are very knowledgeable about the system. I would say the same on their side. So their folks are pretty knowledgeable about what we do and the kinds of penalties and processes. And while they don't advertise our work, I'm sure they talk about our work and kind of the overlaps in the system as part of it.
You talked about the role of industry safety committees as well, associations, and I'm wondering, just a quick question, do we know how many of those there are in the province?
I'm going to defer to Mr. LeBlanc.
Mr. LeBlanc.
Thank you.
No. Thank you.
There are a number of industry safety associations in place, and I may be wrong here. I think the number would be 7. There's construction, retail gasoline, trucking, healthcare, fishing safety, agriculture, and I believe that's the total. And basically, they have been supported by government and by the Workers' Compensation Board. So whenever the industry has identified an interest in collectively bringing some resources together to help improve health and safety, to help define best practices, to provide training, we've done whatever we can, but both in terms of supporting with in-kind resources and also creating structures so that revenues can be collected to fund the associations. And generally, where industry associations have been put in place, they've contributed significantly to changing both behavior and culture in the sectors.
One quick question before turning over to Mr. Scabar. You've looked at what other provinces and perhaps states are doing in relationship to this, and certainly we learn from other jurisdictions, but it seems in this case some other jurisdictions are learning from us, which is really an important thing for the province of Nova Scotia. A quick comment, perhaps?
Mr. Conrad?
Thank you. Absolutely. I mean, certainly one of the things that we undertook and I have to be careful here in saying we because it was these folks, I make it sound like it was me, but it was really these folks that did all the hard work in this process, was a review of other processes in other places. So we're always interested in best practices and what can be done in terms of best practices across the country. We looked at a number of other models, and though our system is not exactly like it, is based upon actually the system from the Yukon. So we based our model off of another existing Canadian model and made recommendations and some changes to it. One of the things that we see in terms of other provinces and other jurisdictions looking at us is actually the way we've set up the administrator and the issuing of the penalties. So one of the things, there's always balance in this, so we get some pressure back to say, why does it take so long for the penalty to get out and those kinds of things. But one of the advantages of the system is by having all of that information flow into a central administrator, we have a great consistency of decision making across the province. So we don't have 35 people out there that have the ability to interpret and make judgment calls and do that. We have that resident in one place. We have great oversight of that through Mr. Garnier. So the coordinator reports to Mr. Garnier. They can talk about individual cases, and we gain great consistency across the province in the way we administer the system. And I think that's one of the things that other provinces looking at our system would like find ways to replicate, would be that element at least, as well as others, but that one for sure.
Thank you for the comments, and congratulations on the job you're doing.
Mr. Scabar.
Thanks very much. I have had occasion to speak with Mr. Garnier lately and the department, and actually thanks for getting back to me so quickly with my concerns. Many of them had been spoken to by now. You mentioned that of the number of reviews done, about 25% resulted in administrative penalties. So out of 4,950 penalties, so about approximately 20,000 businesses were reviewed last year. Is that correct?
Sorry, we have around I think 4,950 is last year's number. It's about 5,000 orders that are issued on an annual basis, and about 1/4 of those would receive penalties. So I think the number Vince gave was 1,123 penalties or something to that effect. So, yeah.
Oh, so I misunderstood.
So 1/4 of the 5,000 would receive a penalty, not 5,000 would receive penalty out of 20.
Oh, okay. Well, yeah. No, that's that. So how many officers do you have on strength to do the reviews?
The way the system works, well, maybe I'll let Mr. LeBlanc.
Mr. LeBlanc, please.
Okay, thanks. In terms of inspection officers in the field, there are 31 officers that are located around the province. We have 5 dedicated investigators that take on the more serious workplace incidents. And then we have some specialty folks, a couple of underground mining engineers, an occupational health and safety engineer, some industrial hygienists. And so it would bring our field staff to a strength complement around in the low 40s, about 42, 43.
Okay, thanks. Now, is materiality an issue when doing an investigation? Like there are, some offenses are, of course, much more serious than others. Does that kind of factor in when a decision is made as to whether or not an administrative penalty is called for?
Mr. Conrad.
There are a number of factors that we look at when we're looking at an administrative penalty, and one of those factors is certainly whether or not there was injury or risk of potential, or what the level of risk of injury to the individual was, or to the people that were involved in the infraction. So yes, materiality does enter in. We would not issue an administrative, the Act and the regulations are fairly robust, as you can appreciate. We have quite a range of employers to look after. So if we were going into an organization, and it's one of the reasons why we want some flexibility in the system. It's not unusual to go into a company and issue a number of orders all related to the same kind of issue. So, a workplace with more than 20 employees that's required to have a health and safety committee and post minutes and do a number of things that doesn't have a committee yet may get a number of orders because they've had infractions of a related nature. They don't have a committee, they haven't posted minutes, they haven't posted the Act. Those aren't the types of things that would result in the issuing of an administrative penalty. We're much more concerned about kind of the things that would be more serious infractions and lead to occupational health and safety injuries in the workplace. Mr. Garnier would like to add to that.
Mr. Garnier.
Thank you. I just want to perhaps clarify in case there may be a misunderstanding. Every order that an officer issues for a contravention is subject to an administrative penalty. So whether the order was for what could be perceived to be a minor administrative contravention or something perhaps more serious, such as a lack of a guard on a machine and that sort of thing. So every one has the potential. So the administrator will actually review every one of them, the minor administrative orders and the more serious. If, for example, an employer receives multiple, 5, 10 orders, all for contraventions, there is a requirement in the policy that the administrator, if he or she feels that 3 or more penalties ought to be issued, that must be first reviewed with me for confirmation. We've built that in as an internal process. However, if, for example, 4 administrative orders have been issued to an employer, the administrator will still look at those 4 administrative orders and could very well issue at least 1 penalty. I'll get a quick example is we would consider administrative order the requirement for a health and safety representative at the workplace if there's 5 to 19 inclusive employees there. That's administrative order. Some people might argue that, well, that's minor, that shouldn't result in a penalty. And we would respond that really that's a key part of the OHS Act in terms of the internal responsibility system. This is part of the rights that employees have. And this is a key responsibility for employers to ensure that that administrative function is fulfilled. So that could very well result in a penalty. Now, mind you, if there's multiple orders and some of them are for more serious contraventions that could have caused an injury to someone, then the administrator will look at those and likely rank them in terms of risk and seriousness. And in all likelihood, the administrator will issue 1 or 2, depending on the suite of orders, and issue what he or she believes is the appropriate penalty or penalties.
So, could you explain to me just briefly the difference between, like, I recognize the concept of the administrative penalty, but like, when would a summary offense be issued? Like, if well, in that same context, like.
I'm sorry, Mr. Gagne.
Thank you. Thank you for that question. There are actually 2 summary offense tickets that the officers may issue here in Nova Scotia. One is for the failure to the workplace party to comply with the order, number 1, and the second is failure to the workplace party that received the order to submit a written compliance notice to the officer. So there are really only 2, and it's important to note that they are really separate from the administrative penalties. A summary offense ticket, one of those 2 summary offense tickets would be issued subsequent to the order and regardless really of what the contravention is. So if I were to receive an order and I failed to comply with it, that's a prosecutable offense, okay? And an administrative penalty wouldn't be issued for that particular offense. Likewise, if I failed to submit a compliance notice or in terms of what I did to comply with the officer's order, that is also a prosecutable offense, which again is separate from the administrative penalties regulation. So they're 2 really separate and distinct issues.
Excuse me, Mr. Skibar, your time has elapsed right now, but there is a second round that will come. I'm going to invite Mr. Caldwell now for 13 minutes in this second round of questioning.
Thank you very much. Just one other thing. Thank you very much for the list. I didn't have that before, but it was given to our office, I understand. So thank you very much for that. Do you also have a breakdown of the fines and penalties per sector? In other words, roofing guys, what percentage are they, and concrete guys, or whatever that is? You can supply it to us, to the committee.
Mr.
Fine.
Garnier.
Yes, actually, in the package that you receive, one of the statistics, the chart is identified as distribution of administrative penalties by industry percentage. So that statistic is there for you to see as well.
Great, thank you. Also, you have the Occupational Health and Safety Appeal Board. How's it made up? Is it from businesses, employees, and employers, unions? How's that structured?
Mr. Conrad.
Thank you. I'm going to ask Mr. LeBlanc to respond to that. There's been some changes to our process recently, so I'm going to ask him to explain a bit about that.
Okay. Originally, the appeal board, or the appeal panel, was constituted under the Occupational Health and Safety Act in 1996, and that was the first appeal process that was created. And at that point in time, it was made up of an independent chair, or a chair that was agreed to by the parties, and there were basically two pools of members that were drawn from as appeals were heard. So there was an employer pool and an employee pool, and both of those pools were selected based on some consultation with the representatives from those specific sides. And the appeal panel itself, although there was an ability to go to a single person appeal, was normally made up of the chair, which was considered neutral, and a winger from both caucuses, from the employer and the employee caucus. With the introduction of the Labour Board in June of this year, the Office of the Appeal Panel and the appeal panel process has been rolled into that process. So we're kind of very much still in a transition period. But some of the principles, I guess, that were established in the health and safety legislation when the appeal panel was introduced will be maintained. So there is an ability to go to a single person appeal panel. There is an ability to go to a three-person appeal with appropriate representation from both employer and employee caucuses on both sides. And we're yet to have our first appeal held under the Labour Board system. So it's very much a system in transition right now.
Are unions part of the employee representation?
Yes, they are, and there's a requirement on the minister to consult with labor organizations in terms of the selection of the pool that can be drawn from.
And is it evenly balanced between employers and employees, employers and unions?
The pool basically has representatives, and in the same token, I guess the minister has a requirement to consult with the labor organizations on the selection of employee representatives for the pool. She also has the requirement to consult with employer representatives on the selection of the employer side of the pool. And the pool then becomes one that can be drawn from as appeal panels are constituted, with members that have been pre-vetted, I guess, in terms of the acceptability to both caucuses.
What percentage of penalties are appealed?
Mr. LeBlanc still?
Right now, it's running at about 30% of appeals. 30% of the admin penalties that are provided are being appealed, and we do have an expectation that that number will go down as people gain some experience, both with the kinds of decisions that the appeal panel is providing, because by far and away most of the appeals that go on the question of the level of the penalty are being confirmed by the appeal panel, and we think as the parties gain that experience, that will sort of temper their decision in terms of whether they want to challenge the system and appeal the penalties.
When the appeal, what's the process if I'm an employer and I'm going to appeal? What do I have to do financially or legally? What do I have to do to properly prepare myself for an appeal?
Okay.
Yep, carry on.
Well, specifically, and there are a couple of different processes depending on the nature of the appeal that you're entering into, but to deal with the admin penalty appeal process, when an employer or an individual receives an admin penalty, there's some standard notes that go on the notice of penalty that identify that the appeal process is available to them and identifies how they can get the documentation that's required, either by phone, email, or what the recipient of the penalty would need to do would be to make the Labour Board aware that they want to appeal and identify the grounds on which they're choosing to appeal the amount of the penalty. At that point, the Labor Board contacts us and they ask us to basically provide some additional justification relative to the decision and the level of penalty. That information is then provided back to the party. The employer gets the logic and the reasoning behind the decision that the administrator chose to issue the penalty and how they came to the amount of the penalty. And there's an opportunity for them to rebut. That process can be iterative until there's no more new information that's being introduced. And then the appeal panel will make a decision in terms of where they think the penalty level should be or if there should be a penalty.
Is there a cost to it, whoever is appealing?
The only cost is really a sunk cost in that it takes the time that's involved in terms of filing the paperwork and then being involved in the process, but there's no charge to appeal a penalty.
How many inspections, daily or weekly, are done by the 31 officers, or monthly? What's the average?
On average, our officers are doing about 100 to 120 inspections or activities a year, so that includes inspections, investigations, some training and consultation, but over time, it averages about 100 to 120.
I didn't hear, what's that, per week or per?
Oh, that would be on an annual basis.
Annual basis, about 120 inspections each?
Yeah.
I can understand that because I imagine likely doing inspections, a lot of follow-up they have to do in some cases.
Yeah, that's correct. I mean, there's a fair amount of documentation. We basically like to, with any of them, some inspections may be just a few hours. Some investigations may take many weeks in terms of the completion of them. And there's a requirement that we try to hold our officers to a standard in terms of the documentation of their activity, so that there is a record, like a fairly strong record available both for the administrator and both for the managers in the system to be able to review our activity. So there's a fair amount of paperwork and a fair amount of computer work associated with the activity in the field.
I know when I had my business, I was inspected a couple of times by your inspectors, and I can say that they were very reasonable to deal with, and as long as you took their advice, you had no difficulty whatsoever, and I would assume that's still the case with the inspections, unless you've done something that you really shouldn't do.
Mr. Conrad.
We're pleased to hear that was your experience. Yes, I mean, I would say that, certainly just in general terms, one of the things we are interested in, as I said earlier, is, our real interest is the health and safety of workers in the province. And we are interested in good collegial relationships. Obviously, that's our preferred model, and we want to work with employers that are interested in working in that environment. So absolutely, those employers that want to work with us, not that we don't have a requirement at times, even with good employers, to take other actions, but our preferred model obviously is to get there in the easiest, most straightforward, most collegial way we can get there, and then we look at our other tools when that doesn't work. So,
as I say, I had very pleasant experiences with them, and in the past, I mean, they identified some things, we rectified them immediately, and they put us in compliance, which was, and I'm glad they did, because I'm sure it did save some injuries, whether they're small or large, it doesn't matter, it saves injuries, and that saves monies for employers. If an employer is in compliance with WMIS and a first aid, is that taken into account when they're considering the terms of fine, or is that just something that's separate or just part of the whole process?
Mr. Garnier.
If they're in compliance with the WMIS regulation or first aid regulation, they will not receive an order or should not receive an order. And by that, they shouldn't receive a penalty or a fine as well. So as long as they're in compliance, there should be no orders. And if there's no orders, there should be no penalties. Now, having said that, if they're in compliance with those sets of regulations, but in non-compliance with something else, then they'll likely be issued an order to remedy that contravention, and that order there could be subject to an administrative penalty.
And then my question was, with that type of order issued, would the level of the fine or the terms of the fine, or whatever the case may be, be less for somebody that's in compliance with WMIS and first aid, or would that just be immaterial in the whole process?
The efforts to prevent the contravention that the administrator will consider and determine whether or not to increase or decrease the penalty really relate to that type of contravention. So the fact that you may be in compliance with other types of regulations is not an overriding factor that the administrator will consider because the person is already or has to already be in compliance with that law anyway. But if they are in contravention, I'll use an example, they have a guard off a machine, that's a violation. But if their other machinery has guards on it and the officer identifies that the workers have a safe work procedure that's written, they've been trained in it, so there's other efforts there that obviously has been made by the employer, then the officer or the administrator will take that into consideration and may decrease the penalty that could be issued from that contravention.
Okay. If an injury, if a violation is noted that doesn't pose a problem for physical injury or physical risk, how long does the business have to comply with the order before a penalty is issued on a non sort of injury type, potential injury type violation?
Thank you. The amount of time provided by the officer for the workplace party to comply with the order will depend on the individual officer. So there's discretion there. Often the officer will consult with the employer or whoever the party that's involved in the contravention may be, and ask them what a suitable or reasonable amount of time is. They don't have to do that, but often the officers will do that. So depending on the type of contravention, it could be an immediate compliance required, or the officer may give them a series of days or weeks. And I'll use a quick example. If first aid training is not at the workplace, which is required under the regulations, then the officer will likely issue an order. We all recognize that it's very difficult for an employer to comply with that in a day because they have to go out and obtain the services of a first aid provider to do that training. So often the employer will give 30 days. Sorry, the officer will give 30 days to the employer to comply. If the employer is still having difficulty securing someone to come in and provide that training, all the employer really has to do is contact the officer, advise that they are making legitimate and reasonable efforts to comply, and request an extension. And more often than not, the officer will provide an extension to that workplace party.
Mr. Colwell, your time has elapsed now. Thank you very much. And I will turn it over to Mr. Porter for 13 minutes.
Thank you, Madam Chair, and thanks to the panel for being here this morning. Answer a few questions. I just have a few. I'm going to go down a bit of a different road here, perhaps, and please take the questions in the spirit in which they are meant. I would first of all start by saying that nothing more important than workplace safety. Having worked in a variety of fields, and one for a long time, which was EHS. We can tell you all about many examples of workplace safety. Just curious about the inspections mostly, and I want to ask first of all about the, I think you get, quick math was around 6,000 inspections in a year. If you've got around 40 people doing 150, was that the right number that I just heard there? Province-wide?
Mr. LeBlanc.
Yeah, the number.
Thank you. There's your light.
Okay. The number was around 100 to 120 activities. So that includes inspections, investigations.
Okay, that's not per inspector then. That's what I wanted to clarify.
Well, it's 100 to 120 per inspector, okay. But so it includes some additional activity in addition to inspection.
Right. So again, then, just of those numbers, would it be reasonable to assume that if you're coming into my place of employment that I would be inspected, and what is the percentage of infractions or rather fines that would go out? So of 10 inspections you do, what's the percentage of fines that are costing employees or employers money?
Mr. Conrad?
I guess there's really two questions in there. So one would be of all the inspections we do, how many are issued orders, and then of the number of orders issued, how many end up with administrative penalties. So at the moment, we're tracking fairly closely the number of the percentage of administrative penalties. So about I think our most recent number is 26% of all of the orders that we issue result in administrative penalties, but there could be multiple orders within one employer, and there could be, so we could have a case where an employer has been issued, has been inspected and there were no orders, or was inspected and there was an order that didn't lead to an administrative penalty, and you could have another case where an employer was inspected, had multiple orders, and had multiple administrative penalties. So I'm not sure I've answered your question, but I think
exactly. Yeah, that's just fine. And that's where I was kind of leading into next anyway. So you could go into an inspection, a warrant and or a future fine, a penalty could end up being 2 or 3 or 4 or any number in one workplace then. Is that accurate?
That's possible, yes.
So when I look at the value per the dollar of fine, it can get fairly expensive for any employer that's not meeting requirements. I think is probably a fair assumption, and they would tell you that. But I'm just kind of curious, when you walk in and you do an inspection, is it a warrant issued immediately by way of, well, I guess a warrant would be issued. I'm just thinking of how much time do they have to comply, and is there some value giving in that compliance before they're actually penalized financially?
So the order is issued, and there is a period of time, as Vince explained, for them to comply with the order, and that period of time, was, again, as Vince said in his earlier response, they have the opportunity to come back and request extensions and things like that. The decision on whether or not there is an administrative penalty assigned is not dependent on whether or not they comply with the order. I think maybe at the heart of what you're getting at. So you can issue an order to someone, they can comply with the order and still receive an administrative penalty even though they've complied. And again, not all, I'm hesitant to use analogies, but we do talk sometimes about the speeding situation, right? So if you're caught speeding, you can get a warning and you can get a ticket, and the fact that you're never going to speed again doesn't change the fact that you have to pay your ticket. So it's similar in that concept of you're being issued an order, you're complying with the order, but the administrative penalty is because the expectation on you was that you pass, that you meet the act and the regulations anyway. So the administrative penalty is not dependent on whether or not you complied with the order.
Yeah, I guess I can understand the analogy to some degree. The other would be there would be some type of, using that analogy, seriousness to the issue of the order. So give me an example of that order then in relation to the speeding analogy you just used. Is it a handrail off, or is it somebody working up above and there's no wall? I mean, I'd like to have a bit of clarity on that analogy.
Again, I'll turn this over to Mr. Garnier to give you some examples, and I do think sometimes, and we are hesitant to use that analogy back to the speeding world. It is much more complex, of course, and I don't mean that that what Highway Patrol does isn't complex, but it's much more complex than the simple example of you've just broken a speed limit. So we use that carefully, but maybe I can let Vince, because I do think some of the examples and things that we've seen, and as you said in your opening remarks, I guess one of the things I would say is being fairly new to the department. I've been at the department now less than 2 years, so there's 2 general comments I would make. We have a distribution list that distributes to key people in the department when a serious incident has happened in a workplace. So we've had a serious workplace injury, a stop work order issued, and things like that to make us all aware. And it's it's a bit of a heart-rending event to look down at your BlackBerry and see that. To see those notices come in that we've had another workplace fatality, and a couple of weeks ago we had someone who lost a portion of a limb and a number of other things. So it's we are dealing with very serious issues oftentimes in the workplace. We deal with a whole range of issues, obviously, but there are still very serious issues. And then the other thing I would say is Vince and I have been back and forth in recent days around some presentations that I've been making, and I said to him it'd be nice to have some visuals to use in some of the pieces that I use, and it's amazing how quickly he can pull out from incidents reports and material that's collected by our officers really fundamental violations of Health and Safety Act and regulations in the province that we see in our work. So this is, you know, in some workplaces are fantastic, and we would acknowledge and celebrate those people, but in some places you have to look very hard to find some really serious things. But maybe I'll let Vince give some examples of the kind of the complexity and the severity and how the administrative penalties respond to that.
Mr. Garnier.
Thank you. I believe there's 12 sets of regulations and 2 acts that the officers will administer on a daily basis. So there's a lot of regulations built in there. Some of them, of course, may be perceived as being administrative in nature and quite minor, and some perhaps more serious. So I guess it depends on various circumstances what the officers are seeing out there. And to point out one example, I recall an officer asked a gentleman to come down from a roof one day, and he was on the roof in contravention of the fall protection scaffolding regulations. So there was no fall arrest on him, and he didn't have proper fall protection set up. And so he came down to the ground, was speaking with the officer. The officer said to him, "Sir, you have to comply with the fall protection regulations, and this is what it says that you need to do." And his response to the officer was, "You ought to leave me alone. I've been in this business for over 20 years. I've fallen off the roof 6 times, and I'm still here. So why are you harassing me?" Okay? So he would perceive that intervention as being disruptive to his activity and perhaps very minor because he feels comfortable on the roof. The officers and we all know differently. We, as the ADM has mentioned, it is pretty tragic to get a phone call from 911 or the police telling us that they have a workplace fatality. And, you know, and very quickly, back in June, we had a worker fall approximately 5 feet, and he died. And if he hadn't fallen and the officer showed up and gave an order and subsequently a penalty was issued, then perhaps that person or the employer might have thought, well, this is a pretty minor thing. He's only 5 feet up. Okay, why am I getting a $500 fine or a $1,000 fine? Well, I just gave you an example of someone who actually fell 5 feet and was killed as a result of that fall. So some of them are perceived by parties as being minor. We take a different position on it, perhaps because of the history that we have, and we know how accidents can and do happen.
Thank you, and the reason I appreciate that example, and you're right, and I would also say that one fatality is one too many. We would hope for no more. The reason I'm going into that, and that was a great example, I want to ask a question about the inspectors, administrators, you all, I guess in general. The qualification, you know, so here we are. These are the people out there on the street doing the inspections construction people, or what's their background by way? And I'm going to ask, what qualifies them to say, hey, buddy, on the roof? You know, or are they just reading a policy? They're hired because of whatever. They're going to read. Anybody can read a policy and you know, put it into place. But those people with the hands-on experience generally have a lot of that knowledge that you just spoke to, and you know, certainly the history as well. But I'm curious about the backgrounds and the qualifications of these people, because this is an important task that we have these people out there in the street doing. And yourself and whoever else who are coming back to review, I guess if I've heard you correctly, the administrator review, you know, is this right? Will we actually give a penalty? You know, what qualifies that to say, here's the value? Because you can't put a value on any life, in my opinion. But anyway, I'll leave that with you. I know our time's running short, but I'll give you an opportunity there.
Mr. LeBlanc.
Okay, thank you. From the perspective of the industry sectors that we're responsible for, we cover everything from the natural resources sectors of fishing and farming through public sectors, healthcare, to the private industry sectors, construction. So I guess what I can say is it's almost impossible to hire one individual that basically knows everything about everything. So what we do and what we look for in our officers is a strong background in one of the sectors. We basically look for experience in health and safety and enforcement activity. And then basically when we hire them, we put them through a mentoring program and an indoctrination program relative to the rules that they're requested to administer, and how we would expect them to be applied. And then we assign a more senior officer that's been in the division for a while to provide them some on-site field experience. We also, and we try to reinforce this with our officers over and over again, we have a wealth of experience and knowledge within the breadth of our organization. And the one thing that we do try and instill in everyone is that if you run into something and you're not sure where what's appropriate, then basically to use the resources within the organization. The other thing that's critical to the health and safety legislation is this concept of internal responsibility. And the officers, during the course of inspection, they're instructed to bring an employee with them during the course of their inspection activity. And the intent of that is to basically open dialogue and provide an opportunity for people that are in the workplace to identify the issues to the officer, who can then make decisions in terms of whether it warrants some intervention on our part in terms of correcting it. So you're right, we can't build a person that has experience in everything that they're going to run across in the course of a day, but we have developed some strategies to make sure that we can bring the right expertise to the problem when it's identified.
Thank you. And how am I doing for time there, Madam Chair?
You have 2 minutes.
Oh, I have 2 minutes still. Oh, great. So on that, then, Mr. LeBlanc, are you saying that realizing that, and I agree, you can't have a specialty, one person look after every specialty. If there were certain incidents, maybe it's a natural resource one or a fishing one or a construction fall, are there certain people only then that, you might send person A, B, or C to go and do that particular call or that incident, or it's not that specialized even?
The way we're organized, we're based on geography. So each officer in the province owns a specific piece of territory. What we have created in the last couple of years is the Special Investigation Unit. So for the more serious accidents, we have individuals that are strategically located around the province whose expertise is in investigations, and they're very familiar with the process. When we run into things, be it construction or be it fishing, where we require some real serious expertise, I guess, engineering support, we basically maintain a system where we contract for that inspection or those qualifications, provide some insight as to what we need answered. So we've tried to develop strategies so we can bring the right resource to the right point, but there's no single individual that basically provides it all.
Thank you. And just one final very quick question. You're in Windsor doing inspections and you're going to a business perhaps that's had a complaint, realizing that a high percentage of them come from that. And you come out and you're all done with that. And when you look across the street, oh, there's a business I've never been to before. Do you go into it, or do you base it on time of day and say, oh, it's late in the day, I got to get back to wherever I'm going? Or I'm just wondering how you fit in the balance of, the non-targeted issue-related ones.
Yeah.
Mr. LeBlanc.
We have capacity in our system to do something we call ad hoc inspections, and it sort of fits in very much to that, in the same way that if an officer in the course of being in their territory is doing a targeted inspection that may take them 15 or 50 kilometers away from their home office, while they're in that physical location, the opportunity to do inspections, if they have time, is basically what we encourage them to do, so that we make the best use of the resource that we have.
No notice required?
No notice required.
Thank
Your
you.
time has elapsed now. Thank you very much. And I'm going to turn it over to Mr. Ramey for the last session of 13 minutes.
Thank you, Madam Chair, and thank you for coming this morning. I think my colleague there from Preston was asking some questions related to the one of the areas I'm interested in, but I'd like to pursue it a bit more. If a administrative penalty is issued and I wish to appeal it, can you give me the time frames? How long do I have, and what the process is? If you could just walk me quickly through that, please.
Mr. Garnier.
Thank you. If a person receives a notice of an administrative penalty, they have 21 days by which to submit their written appeal to the Labor Board.
Okay, so there's 21 days, and then what is the process after that? Like, what do I have to do? I have to appear before a tribunal or a single individual and argue my case? Is that what I have to do?
Mr. Garnier again?
And just to be clear, we don't in the division administer the appeal board or the labor board. However, from my experience, I can say that when a person submits their notice of appeal, then the labor board will acknowledge it and notify us in the division that an appeal has been filed. We will prepare our documentation to support the issuance of the penalty and forward that to the labor board. Once the labor board gets that, they will provide a full copy of that to the appellant because it is it's full disclosure. And then the labor board will ask for a response within a specific period of time, but that time is set by the labor board and not by us.
Okay, and if I may, the labor board then is the overseer of the hearing, correct? Do these parties actually appear in a room, and does someone from your department appear on behalf of the department and the appellant appears on his or her behalf?
Mr. LeBlanc, I think, has something to add to that. I think you're anxious too, so Mr. LeBlanc.
Yeah, not that I was anxious. I just wanted to clarify because the question was very much focused on whether it's an oral hearing or not.
Yes.
And the point, I guess, that I wanted to make is that the administrative appeal process is based on a presumption that it's going to be a paper review. So it's written submissions that are considered, but the labor board has the ability by exception to do oral hearings. So for the appeal penalty system, the regulations were very specific in terms of making it a paper review for an appeal of a penalty.
Okay, so it is a paper process, but it has other possible ramifications.
The labor board, by exception, can permit oral hearings, which would involve presentations and cross-examination of witnesses in front of a hearing. The intent was to try to keep the appeal process simple, and so that's why it's weighted, if you like, towards a paper review of documents that would be submitted.
Understood. And do most of them are solved by the paper process, I take it? Or do you know what the percentage is where you actually have to get into the oral submission?
I'm not aware at this point of any oral appeals that have proceeded under the administrative penalty system. There have been lots of oral hearings and in-person hearings relative to other appeal issues. But in terms of the admin penalty system, to the best of my knowledge, it's all been paper review to this point.
Okay, super. Well, thank you for that. And if I may, I just have one other quick question. I think I heard someone say that the number of workplace injuries and deaths has been decreasing in Nova Scotia, which is great. And I think I also heard somebody say that it's obviously not necessarily attributable to one thing, and I can easily appreciate that. But I'd just be interested in hearing somebody comment on what are the things that are contributing to that. I mean, better education maybe or something. I take it that's one, but.
Mr. Conrad.
Thank you. A really good question, and I will let Mr. LeBlanc speak. He has much more expertise than me and a longer history in this. But I guess in general terms, I would say a few things. So it is a complex challenge, and it's a complex issue that's out there, and we do share responsibility across a wide range of partners. So we have what we call the Workplace Safety and Insurance System, which is a process by which all of the partners in the system, all the stakeholders, try to work together on common issues to get us there. So we see the prevention activities that are out there as huge. So the work that's done by our colleagues at the Workers' Compensation Board. Certainly, we see the education issues as huge. So we see lots of education systems go on through safety associations and others. We see good partners like the community college embedding occupational health and safety training directly into their work. We see our enforcement work as a huge part of that. I think there's quite a number, but rather than read this list that Mr. LeBlanc is writing for me, I'm just going to let Mr. LeBlanc talk.
Yeah. Mr. LeBlanc.
Wasn't actually writing the list for you. I was going to hope that I would be able to remember some things when it was my turn. But just to build on the things that the Associate Deputy Minister has identified, there's so many things that impact workplace health and safety, and it can be anything from, if you think about the number of people that drive for work on any given day, changes to the design of highways, the twinning of highways. There's so many things that impact occupational health and safety. The things that I think hold real promise are the changes that are occurring in the education system. And after many years of working with the Department of Education, last year for the first time there was some core curriculum that was embedded in grade 9 around occupational health and safety, and there have been efforts over the last years to see occupational health and safety topics moved into the options and opportunities programs that are offered in the public school system, in the community college system. So and the whole basis of that is to help people appreciate that every time you make a decision, you're making a decision about the amount of risk you're prepared to accept. And really, it's a cultural change that we're striving to get to. And we have many, many partners in the province in terms of, we've mentioned the Workers' Compensation Board and ourselves on a number of occasions, but the work that safety associations and industry associations do in terms of helping to change behavior is very significant in terms of making changes. So on any given day, you never know what the one initiative will be that will help sort of drive that change. And even, I think it was in Sunday's newspaper, there was an interview with a lady who's lost her husband at sea. And basically she had turned her efforts to producing oil paintings and selling them to buy life vests for fishermen. And it's those sorts of stories and that sort of commitment that basically will change behavior and culture in the province over time.
Thank you very much, and I do agree it's probably a multi-pronged thing. I know the ads on TV, even those pretty simple ads about the saw on the guard, the tape on the pipe, and the bucket, I guess, that's sitting there, the ladder, all those things have an impact too. So thank you very much for that, and I'll turn it over to my colleague, Mr. Skibar.
Mr. Skibar.
Getting back to the numbers of reviews done, so about 1 in 4 inspections results in a administrative penalties. That's about correct? Now, of those, now I realize that the regulations are online and you speak with industry associations and chambers of commerce and pretty much any mechanism out there. Of those that are assessed an administrative penalty, do many of them just say, well, I didn't know that those were the rules, or I didn't know where the what the regulations were, or I wasn't aware that I was called to do this? Like, is that still an issue?
Mr. LeBlanc?
I think that will always be an issue in terms of trying to get information in the right hands, and I don't know what the answer is, but I'm reminded of an order and an admin penalty that was issued, and it was is a hairdressing facility, a salon. And the requirement for first aid training has been in place probably in that industry sector, certainly since 1986, probably before that, in that the Workers' Compensation Act used to have a requirement for first aid training for employers that were covered by them. And it seemed so peculiar for us to have done an inspection in that workplace and have to issue an order for the first time to get first aid training in that location when the requirement had been there for so long. And I don't know what the answer is, to be quite honestly, in terms of raising the awareness with the workplace community and in terms of what the standards are. We certainly take efforts to try and both promote the requirement and spread the information, and we basically make our staff available whenever the opportunity exists to talk about what the requirements are. But we will always be run up against that issue that you've identified where people are not aware of what the requirement is.
Thank you. And with the appeals process, like, yes, I am heartened to hear that they all go through one or, kind of clearing station. So there is like less, no, it's not one officer making one judgment call, another officer making another judgment call. So there is kind of a consistency there. Now, when an appeal is made, you mentioned that they're all pretty much administrative appeals as well, like paper appeals. Is that correct?
For the admin penalty system, yes. the preference and the regulation is weighted to make them paper reviews. Yes.
How well are many of them upheld, or what's our record on that?
The majority of appeals basically are confirm the penalty, and the numbers are again identified in the package that was distributed, but of the 245 that have been decided to date, 185 of them have been confirmed. There have been 37 instances where there's been a decrease, and there's been 3 penalties that have been revoked. And there have been 20 penalties that have been, where the appeal has been dismissed. So it was either filed late or they didn't establish grounds for an appeal. So the numbers are identified in the table.
Okay, so 3 out of 145. So that's a pretty consistent.
It's pretty low. Yeah, it's a pretty low overturn rate.
Pretty good. Okay, thanks very much. Mr. Epstein, if you'd care for last couple of minutes.
There's about a minute.
Good. In that case, I have 2 very quick technical questions. One has to do with orders. We've heard several times from you this morning that previously or still that there was never a mechanism for enforcing an order. And I wonder if you could just confirm that or explain whether there really is some mechanism for enforcing an order. And the other, and perhaps more important question, has to do with the interaction of an administrative penalty and the possibility of a subsequent prosecution. Does the presence of an administrative penalty preclude a subsequent prosecution?
Mr. LeBlanc.
Yes, the regulations specifically identify that if there's a prosecution either being considered or underway, that the administrator would not issue an administrative penalty. So the intent very clearly is you may do one or the other, but you're not going to do both. And on your other question in terms of orders become enforceable through the courts as a prosecution. The question becomes if the order basically says post something in your workplace, whether you'd want to clog up the court system and the judicial process with things that are pretty minor. So it becomes a question of resource allocation.
So technically enforceable, but not conveniently.
Yeah, and so as I think was identified earlier, prosecutions tend to be reserved for the more egregious offenses and activities.
Sure. Thank you very much, and thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Epstein. And with that, our time has elapsed. I had just one request, if I could. There was a comment about getting a breakdown by the sector, and we see that in your report. Could you give us a regional breakdown of where the administrative penalties have been? And because that's something we could receive later. I didn't see it in the report, but if you could, that would be very good. And I had one question that I'd be quite happy to get a written response to, which would be, just because of the materiality question that came up during the questions, I wondered if you could respond just later in writing to whether or not your inspection efforts are in any way guided by the number of workers' compensation claims in a particular industry. And the reason I mention that is the health sector, we know, has a lot of injuries, but it didn't seem to rate its 4% of the penalties issued. So I just wondered if you could comment about, and take your time and answer us later in writing. That's something that could go back to our clerk and would be circulated to all members. So, and with that, I'd welcome you to say a few closing comments. Mr. Conrad.
Absolutely, we can provide both those pieces to you. So I would close by thanking the chair this morning and the members for the opportunity to come and present. As you can see, we're passionate about the work we do, and we believe that the administrative penalty system is a positive tool in our toolkit in terms of the range of actions that we have to take enforcement and regulation to a new place. So we're really pleased to have the ability to use these things. Obviously, we're still in early days, and we have an opportunity to continue to improve the use of the system. One of the things I would say in closing is that And I think I made the comment earlier, you know, in this kind of work, you don't get a lot of people lined up to say thank you for some of these kinds of very difficult conversations. We are blessed. One of the blessings that you do have as an associate deputy or a minister of the Crown is to have wonderful people work for you. So you're lucky enough this morning to see two of the folks that are committed to this work. We do have an exceptional team that work on this across the province and throughout the system, as well as the partners that we work with out there in terms of the safety associations and workers' compensation boards and good employers. And you know, it's a very diverse group, but people are passionate about this work, and it does bring an opportunity to do great things when people are passionate about something that really matters to the citizens of the province. So we're really pleased we were able to come this morning. We're glad to follow up in terms of your requests for further information, or if there are things that come to you afterwards and you want to contact the department and follow up on any questions, we're more than pleased to respond. So thank you so much for the opportunity this morning.
Thank you, Mr. Conrad, and we really do appreciate the efforts that you and your staff are taking to decrease the injury